Chapter 1. A New Beginning. The morning sun cast a warm, golden hue over the small coastal town of Pine Hill. The streets, still damp from the night's rain, sparkled in the early light as the world slowly woke up from its slumber. Amelia Evans sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the packed suitcases resting near the door. Today was the day she had long awaited, yet dreaded just as much. After years of living in the same small apartment, surrounded by memories that both comforted and haunted her, she was finally leaving. It was time for a new beginning, even if the thought filled her with quiet apprehension. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the framed photograph on her nightstand. The image showed a younger Amelia, standing beside her late husband, Ethan. His arm was draped around her shoulders, and their smiles radiated the kind of happiness only found in moments of complete contentment. It had been 3 years since Ethan's sudden passing, and yet the ache in Amelia's heart had not dulled with time. She gently ran her fingers over the glass, her eyes misting as she took a deep breath. The move wasn't just about leaving behind a home. It was about letting go of a life she had planned, one that had shattered in an instant. Her family and friends had encouraged her to move forward, to embrace the future, but Amelia had clung to the past like a lifeline. Until now, the time had come to start over, to rebuild herself in a way she hadn't yet allowed. With a sigh, Amelia stood and walked over to the window, gazing out at the familiar view of the street below. The old oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves rustling softly, as if bidding her farewell. She had spent countless hours beneath that tree, reading, dreaming, and talking with Ethan late into the night. But those moments were gone now, and so was the life she had known. Her new home was several hours away, nestled in the countryside where the hills rolled endlessly beneath a vast sky. It was a place she had never been before, but one that had been recommended by an old college friend. The cottage she had rented was small and tucked away, far from the busy streets of Pine Hill. Amelia had chosen it precisely for its isolation. She needed space to think, to heal, and perhaps to learn how to live again. The day wore on as Amelia finished the final touches of her departure. She cleaned the apartment meticulously, every surface scrubbed as if wiping away the layers of her old life. When the movers arrived, she watched silently as they carried out her belongings, piece by piece, until the space was nearly bare. The furniture that had once filled her home now seemed distant, as though they had never belonged to her in the first place. Amelia took one last walk through the empty rooms. The walls, once adorned with pictures and mementos, now stood stark and quiet. The echoes of her footsteps were the only sound as she made her way to the door. She paused at the threshold, glancing back one final time. There was a sense of finality in the stillness, as if the apartment itself understood that this chapter of her life was over. With a deep breath, Amelia stepped outside and locked the door behind her. The weight of the key felt heavier than usual in her hand, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a deliberate motion, she placed the key in the mailbox for the new tenant and turned away. Her car was packed, the road ahead waiting. There was nothing left for her here. As she drove through the winding streets of Pine Hill for the last time, memories flickered through her mind like the passing landscape. She saw the cafe where she and Ethan had shared their first date, the park where they had picnicked on sunny afternoons, and the small bookstore they had frequented on weekends. Each memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the life they had shared and the one she was now leaving behind. The road stretched on, and the town grew smaller in her rearview mirror. The sky above was a brilliant shade of blue, dotted with fluffy clouds that drifted lazily in the distance. As the miles passed, the weight on Amelia's chest began to lighten, if only slightly. She was moving forward, even if she wasn't sure where that would lead her. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the countryside, Amelia finally arrived at her destination. The cottage stood at the edge of a vast field, surrounded by tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. It was small, with weathered stone walls and a slate roof, but it exuded a quiet charm that immediately soothed her. A garden, overgrown with wildflowers and herbs, framed the front of the house, and the soft trickle of a nearby stream could be heard in the distance. Amelia stepped out of the car, the crisp country air filling her lungs. There was a stillness here, a peace that she had not felt in years. She stood for a moment, simply breathing it in, letting the quiet envelop her. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. The cottage's front door creaked softly as she pushed it open, revealing a cozy interior bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. The furniture was simple but inviting, and a large stone fireplace dominated one wall. Amelia set her bags down and took a slow walk through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. This place was hers now, a new beginning, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with whatever came next. She unpacked slowly, arranging her few belongings with care. Every action felt deliberate, as though she were setting the stage for the life she hoped to rebuild. By the time she finished, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars twinkled faintly in the darkening sky. Amelia sat down by the window, gazing out at the endless fields bathed in moonlight. There was an undeniable sadness in the stillness, but there was also hope, fragile and delicate, like the first buds of spring after a long winter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she was ready to find out. And so, as the night deepened and the world around her quieted, Amelia allowed herself to rest, knowing that this was just the beginning of her journey. Chapter 2: Faded Memories. Amelia awoke the next morning to the soft glow of dawn spilling through the curtains, casting a pale light across the room. The unfamiliar silence of the cottage surrounded her, different from the hum of the city she had left behind. For a moment, she remained still in the bed, listening to the quiet, her mind drifting between the present and the past. The previous day's journey still lingered in her body, a dull ache in her muscles, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the memories she carried with her. Memories of Ethan, of their life together, clung to her like shadows that refused to let go. She had tried to leave them behind in Pine Hill, but they had followed her, trailing her into this new chapter of her life. As she rose and stretched, her gaze fell upon the small stack of photo albums she had brought with her. They sat on the dresser, unopened, like a secret she wasn't yet ready to confront. Each album held fragments of her past, carefully preserved in glossy pages, birthdays, holidays, moments of joy and sorrow captured in time. They were a testament to a life she no longer had, yet couldn't bear to forget. Amelia left the albums untouched and made her way to the kitchen. The cottage was still unfamiliar, every corner and crevice waiting to be explored, but she found comfort in the simplicity of the space. The morning air was cool as she opened the window, letting in the scent of earth and wildflowers. The quiet was different here, softer, more serene. It wasn't oppressive, as it had been in her apartment, but rather a balm to her restless soul. The kettle whistled softly, and soon, Amelia cradled a cup of tea in her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. She walked outside, onto the small porch that overlooked the field beyond. The landscape stretched out before her, bathed in the golden light of early morning. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant hills rolled on endlessly, their peaks catching the first rays of sunlight. She stood there for a long while, sipping her tea, letting the stillness of the countryside settle into her bones. It was a stark contrast to the constant noise of Pine Hill, and in this quiet, she felt both lost and found. The memories of Ethan pressed against her, but there was something new here, a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in years. It was faint, like the first flicker of a flame, but it was there, waiting to grow if she let it. Later that morning, Amelia decided to explore the grounds around the cottage. The garden, overgrown and wild, beckoned her with its tangled beauty. She knelt in the soft soil, her hands sinking into the earth as she cleared away weeds and uncovered flowers long hidden beneath the foliage. It was a slow, methodical process, but one that allowed her mind to wander as her hands worked. As she dug through the soil, she remembered the garden she and Ethan had once tended together. It had been small but vibrant, filled with the colors of roses and lavender. They had spent countless afternoons planting and pruning, their hands dirty and their hearts light. The memory of it brought a bittersweet smile to her lips, the ache of loss mixing with the warmth of that shared joy. The hours passed, and Amelia lost herself in the rhythm of the work. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming her skin as she continued to uncover the hidden beauty of the garden. It was a small, quiet victory, watching the flowers slowly emerge from beneath the wild growth. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of accomplishment, however small. By midday, she had cleared a path through the garden, revealing the old stone steps that led to the back of the cottage. Exhausted but satisfied, Amelia stood back to admire her work. The garden was still far from perfect, but there was progress, and in that progress, she found hope. The afternoon drifted by in a haze of sunlight and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. Amelia wandered through the fields beyond the cottage, her footsteps soft in the tall grass. The landscape seemed to stretch on forever, untouched by time or the chaos of the world beyond. Here, in this secluded corner of the countryside, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As she walked, her thoughts inevitably turned to the life she had left behind. The weight of her grief still clung to her, but it was lighter now, softened by the beauty of her surroundings. Ethan's memory was a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. But here, in this new place, she began to see that there was room for something else as well. There was room for healing, for growth, for the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss. That evening, as the sun began to set, Amelia sat by the window once more, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. The fields outside were bathed in the warm glow of twilight, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. She felt the familiar tug of loneliness, but it was different now. It wasn't the sharp, consuming pain it had once been. It was quieter, more bearable, like the gentle pull of a tide slowly receding. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Grief was not something that could be left behind with the turn of a key or the start of a new chapter. It was something that lived within her, a part of her journey. But here, in this quiet cottage, surrounded by the beauty of the countryside, Amelia felt the first stirrings of hope. The night deepened, and the sky filled with stars, their light twinkling faintly in the vast expanse above. Amelia sat in the stillness, the memory of Ethan's laughter echoing softly in her mind. She allowed herself to remember, to feel the sadness and the love intertwined. But she also allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the grief, a future where she could once again find joy, peace, and perhaps even love. As the hours slipped away and the world around her grew quiet, Amelia closed her eyes and let the night wash over her. The past was still with her, but so was the future, waiting patiently for her to step into it. Chapter 3: Crossing Paths. The following days unfolded in a pattern that was both comforting and unfamiliar to Amelia. The stillness of the countryside wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing the frayed edges of her spirit. Each morning began with the soft golden light filtering through the curtains, and each day ended with the quiet embrace of twilight, the stars shining in the vast sky above. In between, She filled her time with small tasks, tending to the garden, unpacking the last of her belongings, and exploring the winding paths that meandered through the fields surrounding the cottage. On one such morning, after a week had passed since her arrival, Amelia decided to venture farther than she had before. The cottage was nestled on the edge of a small, rural community, separated by hills and wooded areas that seemed untouched by time. A gravel road wound its way through the countryside, flanked by wildflowers and trees whose leaves had just begun to hint at the colors of autumn. It was a place where people lived quietly, their lives intertwined with the land and the changing seasons. Amelia walked slowly along the road, her footsteps light on the gravel. The air was crisp, the scent of earth and grass mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke from nearby farmhouses. As she walked, she noticed small details she had missed before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, or the sound of the wind as it rustled through the leaves. It was as if the world was revealing itself to her piece by piece, offering moments of peace in the quiet beauty of the landscape. After some time, she came upon a small wooden fence that bordered a pasture. Beyond the fence, fields stretched out into the distance, dotted with grazing sheep that moved lazily through the tall grass. The sight of the animals, so calm and content in their surroundings, brought a smile to Amelia's face. She leaned against the fence, watching them for a while, her thoughts drifting in the peaceful stillness. It was then that she noticed a figure in the distance, walking along the edge of the pasture. At first, the figure was too far away to make out any details, but as they drew closer, Amelia could see it was a man, his steps unhurried as he moved through the field. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a lean frame, and he carried himself with an ease that suggested he was familiar with the land. Amelia hesitated, unsure of whether to stay or continue on her walk. She had seen no one during her previous excursions and had grown accustomed to the solitude. But something about the man's presence was reassuring, as though he belonged here in a way she didn't yet understand. The man reached the fence and paused, noticing Amelia for the first time. For a moment, they simply stood there, separated by the wooden rails, both of them caught in the unexpectedness of the encounter. There was no awkwardness in the silence between them, just a mutual acknowledgement of each other's presence. The man gave a slight nod, his face kind, though weathered by the years, and Amelia returned the gesture before turning to continue her walk. As she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back, watching as the man continued on his way through the pasture. There had been something comforting about the brief encounter, though it was nothing more than a shared moment of quiet between two strangers. It reminded her that, while she had come to this place seeking solitude, she was not entirely alone. The encounter lingered in her mind as she continued her walk, her thoughts shifting between the peaceful landscape and the memories of her past. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to connect with anyone outside of her grief. The people in Pine Hill had offered support, but it had always felt distant, as if they didn't truly understand the depth of her pain. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, there was no need for words. The land itself seemed to speak a language she understood, one of healing, of patience, of time. By the time Amelia returned to the cottage, the sun was high in the sky, its warmth settling over the fields like a gentle embrace. She spent the rest of the day tending to the garden, pulling weeds and trimming the overgrown hedges that framed the small plot. The work was steady, grounding her in the present moment, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to focus on something outside of her own pain. As the afternoon wore on, Amelia found herself thinking more about the man she had seen earlier. She wondered who he was, what his life was like here in this quiet countryside. There was a simplicity to the way he had moved through the field, a sense of belonging that she envied. She had come to this place in search of something, perhaps peace, perhaps purpose, but she wasn't sure if she would ever truly find it. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Amelia sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she gazed out at the darkening sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, their light twinkling faintly in the growing night. She had always loved the stars, had often spent hours lying on a blanket in the park with Ethan, pointing out constellations and marveling at the vastness of the universe. But now, the stars felt different. They were still beautiful, but there was an emptiness in them, a reminder of what she had lost. The man's presence in the pasture had stirred something in her, something she hadn't expected to feel again. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was close. It was the possibility that life could continue, even after such profound loss. She didn't know what that meant for her yet, but the thought was there, lingering in the quiet spaces of her mind. The next morning, Amelia set out again, following the same path she had taken the day before. She wasn't sure why, but there was a part of her that hoped to see the man again, to share another moment of silent understanding. She walked along the gravel road, the soft crunch of her footsteps the only sound in the early morning air. The fields were bathed in the golden light of dawn, and the world felt fresh and new, as though anything was possible. When she reached the pasture, she paused, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the man. The sheep grazed quietly in the distance, their heads bent low as they moved through the grass, but there was no one else in sight. Disappointment flickered through her, but she quickly brushed it aside. She had come here to heal, not to seek out the company of others. Still, the quiet hope remained, tucked away in the back of her mind. Amelia continued her walk, the path winding through the fields and into the woods beyond. The trees stood tall and majestic, their leaves whispering in the breeze, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. It was a place of solitude, but it wasn't lonely. Here, in the heart of nature, Amelia felt a connection to the world around her, a connection she hadn't realized she had lost. As she walked, her thoughts turned once more to Ethan, to the life they had shared and the life she had left behind. The memories no longer felt as sharp, the edges softened by time and distance. She would always carry them with her, but they didn't have to define her. There was more to life than grief, and maybe, just maybe, there was still room for something new. The day passed in a blur of quiet moments, of walking, of thinking, of allowing herself to simply be. By the time she returned to the cottage, the sun was setting once again, casting a warm glow over the fields. Amelia stood on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, and for the first time since Ethan's death, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. It was hope. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Amelia knew that her journey was far from over. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready to face it, whatever it might be. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Chapter 4. The Echoes of Silence. The days at the cottage had begun to settle into a gentle rhythm, as if the land itself was showing Amelia how to live again. She woke with the sun, her mornings filled with quiet tasks, making tea, tending to the garden, and walking through the fields, letting the soft earth under her feet anchor her to the present. The serenity of the countryside slowly seeped into her bones, creating a space within her that had long been overshadowed by grief. Autumn had started to paint the world around her in deep, vibrant hues of gold and crimson. The leaves were changing, falling one by one, fluttering in the wind like whispers of the past. Each day, the sun seemed to linger a little less, the air growing cooler as the season turned. Amelia embraced the changes, finding comfort in the cycle of the earth, in the way life moved forward even when everything else seemed to stand still. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Amelia decided to explore beyond the familiar paths she had walked so far. There was a road leading out of the village that she hadn't yet followed, one that curved through the hills and disappeared into the horizon. Something about it intrigued her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain, as though the road held secrets that were waiting to be discovered. She packed a small bag with essentials, an old notebook, a bottle of water, and an apple, and set out toward the unknown. The road, gravel beneath her boots, wound its way through the rolling landscape, the gentle rise and fall of the hills creating a sense of isolation. As she walked, the village faded from view, leaving only the expanse of fields, woods, and sky. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant call of birds. Amelia found herself sinking into that silence, her mind free to wander. Thoughts of Ethan still surfaced, but they were softer now, like echoes from another time. The memories didn't hurt as much as they used to. Instead, they lingered in the background, a part of her, but no longer all of her. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Amelia came across a narrow footpath branching off from the main road. It was overgrown with wildflowers and brambles, as though it hadn't been used in years, but something about it called to her. Without thinking, she turned onto the path, curiosity driving her forward. The path led her deeper into the woods, where the trees grew taller and the air grew cooler. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above. There was a stillness here, an untouched quality that made her feel as though she had stepped into another world. Every step was accompanied by the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of pine and moss heavy in the air. After walking for what felt like hours, Amelia came upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a small stone house, its roof half covered in creeping ivy. It was old, weathered by time, yet there was something striking about it. The windows, though dark and empty, seemed to watch her, as if the house itself was aware of her presence. Amelia paused at the edge of the clearing, her heart beating a little faster. There was no sign of anyone living there, no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of recent activity. But the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt waiting. For a moment, she considered turning back, but something inside her urged her to stay, to see what lay beyond the threshold of this forgotten place. She walked slowly toward the house, her footsteps muffled by the moss and fallen leaves. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted with age, and as she stepped closer, a gust of wind caught it, pushing it open just enough for her to slip inside. The interior was dim, the air thick with the smell of wood and dust. Amelia's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and as she looked around, she realized that the house wasn't empty after all. There were traces of a life once lived here. An old chair by the fireplace, a table with a cracked ceramic vase, shelves lined with books and trinkets long forgotten by time. It was as if the house had been frozen in a moment, waiting for someone to return and fill it with life again. Amelia wandered through the small rooms, her fingers brushing over the surfaces, her mind drifting back to her own life, to the home she had shared with Ethan. The memories stirred again, but this time, they felt different. They didn't pull her under as they once had. Instead, they were like a familiar song, one that played softly in the background of her thoughts, no longer overwhelming her. In one corner of the room, she found an old desk, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and broken quills. Beneath the dust, she could see the remnants of a life once filled with creativity, with dreams and aspirations that had long since faded. Amelia sat down at the desk, running her fingers over the papers, feeling a strange connection to the person who had once sat here. Her gaze fell on a small leather-bound book, tucked away beneath a pile of loose papers. It looked worn, the edges frayed, as though it had been well-loved and often used. She picked it up, opening it carefully. Inside, she found pages filled with sketches, landscapes of the countryside, portraits of people she didn't recognize, and small, detailed drawings of flowers and animals. The artistry was beautiful, but what struck Amelia the most was the sense of longing that seemed to permeate the pages. Whoever had created these drawings had poured their heart into them, capturing the world as they saw it, with all its beauty and sorrow. She couldn't help but feel a kinship with the artist, as though they, too, had sought solace in creativity in the face of loss. As she sat there, leafing through the book, time seemed to slow. The world outside the little stone house faded away, leaving only the quiet presence of the past. Amelia didn't know how long she stayed there, lost in the sketches, but eventually, the light from the windows began to dim, signaling the approach of evening. She stood up, carefully placing the book back where she had found it, and took one last look around the room. There was something comforting about the house, despite its emptiness, and as she stepped back outside into the fading light, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The walk back to the cottage was slow and thoughtful, the evening air cool against her skin. The sky above had turned shades of purple and pink, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the distance. As she walked, Amelia's mind returned to the sketches, to the artist who had once called that place home. She wondered who they had been, what their life had been like, and why they had left the house behind. But more than that, she wondered what it meant for her own journey. The discovery of the house felt like a turning point, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, there was life, there were stories, and perhaps there was still more of her story left to tell, more than just the grief that had consumed her for so long. By the time she reached the cottage, the stars were out in full, their light casting a soft glow over the fields. Amelia stood on the porch for a while, gazing up at the sky, feeling the quiet hum of the earth beneath her feet. The night was still, and in that stillness, she found herself once again on the edge of something new. The echoes of her past were still there, but they were quieter now, fading into the background as the present stretched out before her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. It felt like an invitation, one she was finally ready to accept. With that thought, she turned and went inside, closing the door softly behind her, leaving the night and the memories to fade away into the silence. Chapter 5. The Tides of Memory. The days began to blur together as autumn deepened, casting the countryside in a palette of fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows. The cool air was laced with the scent of earth and fallen leaves, and Amelia found herself increasingly drawn to the outdoors, where the changing season mirrored the subtle shifts happening inside her. Every morning, she walked through the woods or across the fields, her steps slow and thoughtful, her mind wandering as freely as the wind that rustled through the trees. She often found herself returning to the path that led to the stone house in the woods. There was something about that place, its quiet solitude, the traces of a life once lived, that called to her. It became a retreat of sorts, a place where she could sit in stillness and let the world outside fade away. The more time she spent there, the more connected she felt to it, as though the house itself held some key to her healing, to the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. On one such afternoon, as the sky hung low and gray with the threat of rain, Amelia packed her bag with a notebook and set out for the house. The wind had picked up, stirring the fallen leaves into small, swirling eddies that danced around her feet. The landscape was quiet, save for the occasional caw of a crow in the distance, its harsh cry echoing through the still air. There was a weight to the day, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the coming storm. When Amelia reached the house, she slipped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of wood and dust. She moved through the rooms with ease now, her fingers brushing over the old furniture, the faded curtains, the forgotten objects that seemed to tell a story of their own. She sat down at the desk in the corner, the one where she had found the sketchbook, and pulled out her own notebook. The act of writing had always been a solace for her, even in the darkest moments of her grief. She had filled pages with thoughts and memories, trying to make sense of the world she had been thrust into after Ethan's death. But lately, the words had come more slowly, the sharp edges of her pain softened by time. Now, as she sat in the quiet of the old stone house, she found herself drawn not to the past, but to the present, to the stillness of the moment. She opened the notebook and began to write, her pen moving steadily across the page. The words came easily, flowing like a river, not from a place of sadness, but from a place of reflection. She wrote about the house, about the land, about the way the seasons seemed to hold a wisdom that she was only just beginning to understand. The act of writing felt different now, less about escaping her pain, and more about embracing the life that still stretched out before her. As she wrote, the sound of rain began to patter against the roof, soft at first, then gradually increasing in intensity. The storm had arrived, but inside the house, Amelia felt sheltered, cocooned in the safety of its walls. She set down her pen for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the rain as it fell, steady and insistent, washing over the landscape in a cleansing wave. The rain brought with it a sense of renewal, of something being washed away, leaving behind a blank slate. Amelia thought of the sketches she had found, the artistry of the person who had once called this place home. She imagined them sitting at the same desk, looking out at the same fields, finding inspiration in the quiet beauty of the world around them. There was a sense of kinship there, a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone with one's thoughts, to seek solace in creativity. The rain continued to fall, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and green. Amelia stood and walked to the window, watching as the storm moved across the fields. The sheep had gathered under a large oak tree for shelter, their woolly bodies huddled together against the elements. Beyond them, the hills rolled gently into the distance, disappearing into the mist that hung low over the horizon. As she stood there, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought of in years. It was of a time long before Ethan, before the weight of loss had settled on her shoulders. She had been a child, no more than 10 years old, and she and her family had gone to the beach during a storm. She remembered standing at the water's edge, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the waves crashing against the shore with a power that both frightened and exhilarated her. Her father had stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her against the force of the wind. They had stood there together for what felt like hours, watching the storm roll in over the ocean, the sky dark and ominous, the sea churning in response. It had been one of those rare moments where everything seemed to stand still, where time slowed and the world became something more than just the sum of its parts. She had felt small in the face of it, but also connected to something larger than herself, a feeling that had stayed with her long after the storm had passed. Now, standing in the old stone house, watching the rain fall against the window, Amelia felt that same sense of connection. The storm outside was different, quieter, but it held the same promise of change, of something being washed clean. And as the rain continued to fall, she realized that she was ready for that change. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of meditative stillness. Amelia returned to her notebook, writing in fits and starts, allowing her thoughts to drift in and out like the tide. She wrote about the memories that had resurfaced, about the house, about the life she had left behind, and the one that was slowly unfolding before her. There was no urgency to the writing, no need to capture every thought or feeling. It was enough to simply be in the moment, to let the words come as they would. By the time the rain began to let up, the sky was growing darker, the last light of the day fading into the horizon. Amelia gathered her things and left the house, closing the door gently behind her. The air outside was cool and fresh, the ground damp beneath her feet. The world felt new, washed clean by the storm, and as she walked back along the path, she felt a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before. The return to the cottage was quiet, the sky above dotted with stars that had begun to peek through the thinning clouds. Amelia felt the weight of the day settling over her, but it wasn't a heavy burden. It was the kind of tiredness that came from a day well spent, a day where something inside her had shifted, however subtly. As she reached the cottage and stepped inside, the warmth of the small space greeted her, the familiar scent of wood and herbs filling the air. She lit a candle on the kitchen table and sat for a while, gazing into the flickering flame, letting her mind drift back over the events of the day. There was a quiet sense of satisfaction, of having found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. That night, as Amelia lay in bed, the sound of the rain still faintly audible in the distance, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The storm had passed, both outside and within her, and in its wake, she was left with a feeling of clarity, of calm. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty didn't frighten her. Instead, it felt like an open door, waiting for her to step through and see what lay on the other side. And as she drifted off to sleep, the memories of the past gently fading into the background, Amelia knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The tides of memory had carried her this far, and now she was finally beginning to see the shore. Chapter 6: A Letter from the Past. The days following the storm were bright and crisp, with the sun shining more brightly than it had in weeks. The sky stretched wide and blue above Amelia as she went about her routine, each task carrying a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The change in the weather mirrored the shift in her heart. Life seemed to hum around her, small and steady but alive, a slow yet persistent rhythm that kept her grounded. One morning, as Amelia sat in her usual spot at the kitchen table, the soft morning light pouring in through the window, she decided to go through a stack of old letters and papers that had been gathering dust in a corner of the cottage. Most of them were mundane: bills, notices, and letters from acquaintances long forgotten. She sorted through them with mild interest, the repetitive motion comforting in its simplicity. But as she reached the bottom of the pile, something caught her eye. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, tucked beneath the rest of the papers. The handwriting on the front was faded but familiar, so familiar that her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen that script in years. It was Ethan's handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope, staring at it for a long moment. The postmark was dated several months before his death, but for some reason, the letter had never been opened. Amelia couldn't recall seeing it before, and she wondered if it had gotten lost in the shuffle of their lives, buried beneath the avalanche of grief that had followed his passing. For a moment, she considered setting it aside, leaving it unopened, as if reading it would disturb the delicate balance she had only just begun to achieve. But something compelled her to open it, a quiet voice in the back of her mind urging her forward. Slowly, carefully, she tore open the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was familiar, strong and deliberate, the way Ethan always wrote when he was trying to express something important. As Amelia read, her eyes moved over the words, her heart quickening with each line. It was a simple letter, written during one of his business trips, full of the small details of his days away: meetings, dinners, long nights in hotel rooms. But beneath the surface, there was something more, something unspoken. Ethan had written about how much he missed her, how he wished he could be there with her instead of halfway across the country. He wrote about the plans they had made, the future they had dreamed of together, and how he couldn't wait to come home and see her again. It was a love letter, in the quiet, understated way that Ethan had always shown his love. He didn't write about grand gestures or sweeping emotions. He wrote about the small, everyday moments that made their life together so precious. As Amelia read, a tear slipped down her cheek, then another. The weight of the words, the tenderness behind them, settled over her like a blanket. She had thought she had processed her grief, thought she had faced it head-on, but this letter was a reminder that grief wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, returning when least expected, carrying with it the echoes of what was lost. When she finished reading, she sat for a long time, the letter resting in her lap, her mind adrift in the memories it had stirred. She could almost hear Ethan's voice in her head, could almost feel his presence beside her, as though he had never really left. And in that moment, she realized something. He hadn't. He had been with her all along, not just in the memories she clung to, but in the quiet moments, the decisions she made, the life she was still living. The letter was a reminder, not just of the love they had shared, but of the life that still stretched out before her, the life that was hers to live. She had spent so long carrying her grief like a heavy stone, afraid to let it go, afraid that letting go would mean losing him all over again. But now, with the letter in her hands, she understood that she didn't have to let go of Ethan to move forward. He was a part of her, always would be, but that didn't mean she had to remain stuck in the past. The day passed in a haze, Amelia moving through the hours with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the letter, of the words it carried, stayed with her, but it was no longer a burden. It was a gift, a piece of Ethan she hadn't known was waiting for her, a reminder that love could transcend even the deepest sorrow. That afternoon, she took a long walk through the fields, the sun warm on her face, the wind gentle against her skin. The world seemed brighter, more vivid, the colors sharper than they had been before. She watched as the leaves, now fully golden, drifted down from the trees, carried by the wind like whispers from the past. Each step she took felt purposeful, deliberate, as though she was walking towards something new, something waiting just beyond the horizon. As she walked, she thought of the life she had built here, the quiet days in the cottage, the solace she had found in the simple rhythms of the countryside. It was a good life, one that had given her space to heal, to rediscover herself in the aftermath of loss. But now, for the first time, she found herself wondering what came next. She had spent so long in the shadow of her grief that she hadn't considered the possibility of a future beyond it. When she returned to the cottage that evening, the light fading from the sky, Amelia went back to the kitchen table where the letter still sat. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn edges, and then, without hesitation, she placed it carefully into her notebook. It felt right to keep it there, tucked away with the rest of her thoughts and reflections, a part of her story but not the whole of it. That night, as she lay in bed, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The letter had stirred something inside her, something she couldn't quite put into words, but it was a feeling of readiness, of openness to whatever the future might hold. For so long, she had been living in the past, but now, she was beginning to see that the past didn't have to define her. It was a part of her, yes, but it wasn't all of her. And as she drifted off to sleep, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside, she knew that tomorrow would be a new day, a day filled with possibilities, with hope, with life. The tides of memory had carried her this far, and now, she was ready to step into the current and let it take her where it would. Chapter 7. Threads of the Future. The first frost of winter arrived early, settling over the land in a crisp, silvery veil. The once vibrant autumn leaves had fallen, and the trees stood bare against the pale sky, their branches reaching like dark fingers toward the heavens. Amelia woke early that morning, the cold biting through the window panes, making the world outside look sharp and quiet, as though holding its breath before the snow arrived. The change in the weather brought with it a change in Amelia's mood. There was an energy in the air, a quiet urgency that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of things. The letter from Ethan still lingered in her thoughts, but its sharpness had dulled over the past few weeks. It was no longer a painful reminder of what she had lost, but a quiet whisper of what she still carried within her: love, memory, hope. Bundled in her thick coat and scarf, Amelia stepped outside into the frosty morning, her breath forming small clouds in the air. The ground crunched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the fields, the world around her silent and still. The sheep were clustered near the barn, their woolly coats thick against the chill. In the distance, the hills rolled gently toward the horizon, their tops dusted with frost, giving the landscape an ethereal glow. As she walked, Amelia felt a sense of peace settling over her, the kind of quiet contentment that came from being fully present in the moment. The past few months had been difficult, but they had also been transformative. She had come to this place seeking solitude, a space to heal from the wounds of her loss, but in the process, she had found something more: a connection to the land, to herself, and to the life that continued to unfold around her. She had spent so long in the shadow of her grief, afraid to move forward, afraid to let go of the life she had shared with Ethan. But now, as she walked through the fields, the crisp air filling her lungs, she realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean leaving behind the memories or the love they had shared. It simply meant embracing the present, opening herself up to the possibility of a future she hadn't yet imagined. The days stretched out before her, filled with small tasks and quiet moments of reflection. Amelia found herself drawn more and more to the stone house in the woods, where she spent hours sketching and writing, the solitude of the place offering her a kind of clarity she hadn't known she needed. The house, once a relic of the past, had become a space of renewal, a place where she could let her thoughts drift and settle, where the lines between memory and possibility blurred. One afternoon, as she sat at the desk by the window, watching the soft light of the setting sun filter through the trees, Amelia found herself thinking of the future. It was a thought she hadn't entertained in a long time. What came next? What she wanted her life to look like now that the weight of her grief had begun to lift. The letter from Ethan had opened a door inside her, one she hadn't even realized was closed, and now she was beginning to feel ready to step through it. The first stirrings of an idea began to take shape in her mind, tentative and uncertain, like the first shoots of green poking through the winter snow. She thought of the cottage, of the land that stretched out around it, of the way the seasons moved in quiet cycles, each one bringing with it a sense of renewal. She thought of the work she had done in the months since arriving here, the way she had thrown herself into caring for the land, for the animals, for the small, everyday tasks that had become a part of her routine. And then, slowly, a vision began to emerge. It wasn't grand or sweeping, but it was clear, steady. Amelia could see herself staying here, not just for the short term, but for the long haul. She could see herself building a life on this land, caring for it, nurturing it, just as it had nurtured her. The idea settled in her chest like a quiet certainty, and with it came a sense of purpose, of direction. The following days were filled with a kind of quiet preparation, though Amelia didn't fully realize it at the time. She spent more time tending to the garden, even though winter was fast approaching and most of the plants had already gone dormant. She found herself making small improvements around the cottage, repainting the door, repairing the fence, mending a leaky roof. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step towards something larger, something she couldn't quite name yet. One morning, after a particularly cold night, Amelia awoke to find the world outside blanketed in a soft layer of snow. The landscape had transformed overnight, the fields and trees covered in a pristine white that glittered in the pale light of dawn. She stood at the window for a long time, watching as the sun slowly rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The snow brought with it a sense of stillness, of quiet reflection. Amelia felt a strange mix of emotions as she stood there: gratitude for the life she had built, sorrow for the one she had lost, and a growing sense of anticipation for whatever came next. The past was still with her, woven into the fabric of who she was, but it no longer held her in its grip. She was ready, she realized, for the future, whatever it might bring. That afternoon, as she walked through the snow-covered fields, Amelia felt a deep connection to the land, to the rhythm of the seasons that moved through it, to the life that thrived even in the depths of winter. She thought of the future, of the possibilities that stretched out before her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of excitement. There was so much ahead of her, so much to do, so much to discover, so much to build. The vision of her future continued to take shape in the days that followed. Amelia found herself sketching out plans, not just for the cottage, but for the land around it. She imagined expanding the garden, perhaps even planting an orchard in the spring. She thought of ways to make the cottage more self-sustaining, more connected to the rhythms of the natural world. The ideas flowed easily now, each one building on the last, until the future she had once feared seemed not just possible, but within reach. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, white silence. Amelia moved through the days with a sense of purpose, each task bringing her closer to the life she was beginning to envision. The cottage, once a place of refuge, had become a place of possibility, and with each passing day, the threads of her future wove themselves more tightly into the fabric of her present. As winter settled in, the days grew shorter and the nights colder, but inside the cottage, there was warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow over the room as Amelia sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her. She wrote about the future, about the plans she was making, about the life she was beginning to build. And as she wrote, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace, to build, to shape with her own hands. And as the snow continued to fall outside, covering the land in a thick, white blanket, Amelia knew that she was ready to step into it, to let the threads of her past and present weave themselves into something new, something beautiful. The land outside slept beneath the snow, waiting for the warmth of spring to bring it back to life. And in the quiet of the cottage, Amelia waited too, her heart open, her hands ready to create, her future stretching out before her like a blank canvas, waiting for her to make her mark. Chapter 8. The Seeds of Spring. Winter clung stubbornly to the land, the snow thick and unmoving, as if it were determined to hold on just a little longer. The days were short and the nights were long, with the cold creeping through the cottage despite the fire that burned steadily in the hearth. Yet, in the stillness of the winter months, Amelia found herself feeling more alive than she had in years. Her mornings began early, long before the sun rose, with the familiar routine of tending to the animals and making sure the cottage was warm. The fields lay dormant under the snow, the garden little more than a memory of what had bloomed there the summer before. But in the back of her mind, Amelia was already thinking of the spring, of the seeds she would plant, of the new life that would emerge from the frozen earth. One cold afternoon, Amelia found herself standing at the edge of the fields, staring out at the snow-covered expanse before her. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the clouds hanging low, threatening more snow. Everything was still, the world wrapped in a deep, quiet silence, and yet, beneath the surface, Amelia could sense the stirrings of life. It was too early to see it, too soon to feel it in the earth, but she knew it was there. The seeds of spring were already waiting, hidden beneath the snow, ready to burst forth when the time was right. It was a comforting thought, The idea that life could lie dormant for so long, only to emerge again when the conditions were right. Amelia felt a kinship with the land, with the way it moved in cycles, each season building upon the last, each one necessary for the next to thrive. Her own life had moved through seasons, too. Seasons of love, of loss, of healing. And now, she sensed she was on the cusp of something new. Something that had been waiting beneath the surface for longer than she realized. The cottage, once a place of refuge from the storm of her grief, had become a place of creation. Amelia spent long hours working with her hands, repairing old furniture, crafting small items from wood, tending to the animals, and making improvements to the cottage itself. There was something deeply satisfying in the physicality of the work, in the way it grounded her in the present moment, allowing her to focus on the task at hand rather than the swirling thoughts of the past or the future. As the weeks passed, the snow began to melt, slowly at first, then all at once in a sudden burst of warmth. The sun returned, pale and weak at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. The land, still cold and wet, began to awaken, the first signs of spring stirring in the fields and trees. Amelia could feel it in the air, a quiet hum of energy that buzzed beneath the surface of things. One morning, as she walked through the now thawing fields, Amelia stopped at the edge of the garden. The soil was still dark and muddy, the remnants of last year's growth long gone, but she could already picture what it would look like in a few months' time. Rows of vegetables, herbs, flowers, all growing together in a riot of color and life. It would be her first real garden here, the first time she would plant something knowing she would be here to see it grow, to harvest it when the time came. The thought filled her with a quiet excitement, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She knelt down, her fingers sinking into the cool, wet earth, and for a moment, she simply sat there, feeling the soil between her fingers, the promise of what was to come. She thought of the seeds she had tucked away in the cottage, waiting to be planted, and she knew it was time to begin preparing. Over the next few days, Amelia threw herself into the work of readying the garden for spring. She cleared away the debris left over from the winter, pulling up dead plants and old roots, turning over the soil to loosen it after the long months of frost. Her hands ached from the work, her muscles sore, but she didn't mind. There was something invigorating about the labor, something deeply satisfying about seeing the results of her efforts in the newly cleared beds, ready for planting. As she worked, her mind wandered to the life she was beginning to build here, to the way the land had become not just a refuge, but a foundation for something new. The isolation that had once felt like a burden now felt like a gift, a space to create, to grow, to discover who she was and what she wanted. The grief that had weighed so heavily on her heart had lightened, its sharp edges worn smooth by time and the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun begin to dip toward the horizon, Amelia thought of Ethan. It had been months since she had read his letter, and though she still thought of him often, the memories no longer felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. They were a part of her, woven into the fabric of her life, but they no longer defined her. She had loved him deeply, and that love would always be a part of her. But now, she was beginning to see that there was room in her heart for something more, for the life she was creating here, for the future that stretched out before her. The first signs of new life began to appear in the garden. Small, green shoots poking up through the soil, delicate and fragile, but full of promise. Amelia tended to them carefully, watering them each morning, watching as they grew stronger with each passing day. The garden became a metaphor for her own life, a reminder that growth was a slow, patient process, one that required care and attention, but also a willingness to let go of control, to trust that things would unfold as they were meant to. As the days grew warmer, the garden flourished. The vegetables began to grow, their leaves broad and green, while the flowers bloomed in a riot of color, their petals soft and fragrant. Amelia spent hours in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, her heart light with the joy of seeing the fruits of her labor come to life. The cottage, once so quiet and still, was now filled with the sounds of birdsong, of the wind rustling through the trees, of life moving in its steady, unhurried rhythm. Amelia felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her, the kind of peace that came not from having everything figured out, but from knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. The future, once so uncertain, now felt full of possibility. There was still so much ahead of her, so many things to learn, to create, to experience, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it. As she stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the hills, Amelia smiled to herself. The seeds of spring had taken root, not just in the soil, but in her heart. And as the days stretched out before her, filled with the promise of new beginnings, she knew that whatever the future held, she was ready to meet it with open arms. The garden, like her life, was a work in progress, a testament to the power of patience, of resilience, of hope. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Amelia knew that she had finally found her place, not just in the cottage, but in the world. The threads of her past had woven themselves into the fabric of her present, and now she was ready to move forward, one step at a time, into the future she had begun to create. Chapter 9. The Unexpected Journey. Summer arrived with a flourish, filling the valley with warmth, light, and life. The snow was long gone, replaced by the vibrant greens of the fields and the deep blue of the sky stretching endlessly above. The garden was now in full bloom, the vegetables ripe for harvesting, the flowers a brilliant splash of color against the cottage's stone walls. Birds flitted through the trees, their songs mixing with the soft hum of bees hovering over the blossoms. Amelia woke each morning to the sound of nature coming alive around her, the sunlight spilling into the cottage, painting everything in soft, golden hues. It was a world transformed from the stark, cold days of winter, a world that had burst into life with an energy that was both joyful and relentless. The days were long now, filled with warmth and the steady rhythm of her work. Each morning she rose early, tended to the animals, and then spent hours in the garden, pulling weeds, harvesting vegetables, and nurturing the life that surrounded her. But even amidst the beauty of the summer, there was a deeper transformation happening within Amelia. It was subtle, slow, like the steady growth of the plants in her garden. As the days stretched on, she found herself more connected to this land than she had ever imagined she could be. The isolation that once felt daunting had become a comfort, the quiet of the valley a place of solace. Here, she wasn't running from her past anymore. She wasn't weighed down by the memories of what she had lost or by the fear of what the future might bring. Amelia stood in the garden one morning, watching as the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft, dappled shadows on the ground. She knelt down by the rows of tomato plants, their vines heavy with ripening fruit. She picked a handful, the coolness of the tomatoes smooth in her hands, and placed them in the basket by her side. The air was warm, a light breeze stirring the leaves, carrying with it the scent of lavender and fresh earth. The work was physical, her body moving in sync with the land, but there was something about it that brought her a deep sense of peace. It was as if, with each seed planted, each weed pulled, she was mending something inside herself. Her hands in the soil were no longer just about growing food. They were about grounding herself in this place, in this moment. The connection she felt to the earth, to the rhythm of the seasons, had become a part of her identity, a part of who she was becoming. By afternoon, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Amelia made her way back to the cottage, the basket now full of ripe vegetables, zucchini, tomatoes, peppers, herbs freshly picked from the garden. The summer heat made the air thick and heavy, but there was something comforting in the weight of it, as if the world was holding her close. She could feel the season wrapping itself around her, filling the space inside her that had once felt so empty. Inside the cottage, Amelia set the basket on the kitchen table and began preparing a simple meal. The windows were open, letting in the sounds of the world outside. The distant hum of insects, the occasional call of a bird, the rustling of the trees in the wind. The kitchen was warm, the light pouring in, making everything glow. As she worked, slicing vegetables, kneading dough, she felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over her. The cottage had transformed over the months, just as she had. It was no longer just a refuge from the world. It had become her home. The repairs she had made, the small improvements, the garden outside, all of it was a reflection of the life she was building here, a life that was steady, simple, but full of meaning. The loneliness she had once feared had been replaced by a quiet companionship with the land itself, with the animals, with the endless cycles of nature that moved around her. As the meal simmered on the stove, Amelia stepped outside, the warm air washing over her. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. She walked to the edge of the garden, where the field stretched out in front of her, the hills in the distance bathed in the soft light of evening. The landscape was alive with color, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, the grass rippling like waves in the golden light. She stood there for a long time, watching as the world shifted from day to night, the sky deepening, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The beauty of the moment took her breath away, but it was more than that. It was the sense of belonging, of being a part of this vast, wild landscape, of knowing that this was where she was meant to be. For the first time in a long while, Amelia felt truly at peace with herself and her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air began to cool, the first hints of night settling over the valley. Amelia turned back toward the cottage, her heart full, her mind quiet. The future, once so uncertain, now felt like an open field before her, filled with endless possibility. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, that didn't scare her. She had learned, through the slow rhythm of the seasons, that life had its own way of unfolding, of bringing change, of planting new seeds even when you weren't looking. Back inside the cottage, the smell of her meal filled the air. Amelia sat at the table, her plate filled with the bounty of her garden, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. There was something deeply satisfying in knowing that the food on her plate had come from her own hands, from the land she had nurtured and cared for. It was a small thing, but it felt like a triumph, a reminder of how far she had come. As she finished her meal, the sky outside darkened, the stars now twinkling brightly overhead. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Amelia curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her, and let the warmth of the fire lull her into a state of calm. Her thoughts drifted, not to the past or even to the future, but to the simple pleasures of the present moment. The warmth of the fire, the cool night air drifting in through the open window, the soft glow of the stars outside. The summer night stretched out before her, quiet and still, the world settling into a peaceful silence. And as Amelia closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of her heart, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The seasons would change again, as they always did, but for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. The threads of her life had woven themselves into something beautiful, something strong, and for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. The stars continued to shine outside, the fire burned low in the hearth, and the world around Amelia moved in its slow, steady rhythm, a rhythm that she had come to trust, to embrace. The night deepened, and with it came the promise of a new day, a new beginning, waiting just beyond the horizon. Chapter 10. The Quiet Before the Storm. The days grew shorter as autumn began to creep into the valley. The air had lost its summer warmth, and the mornings arrived with a crispness that made Amelia wrap her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The trees, once lush and green, had started to change, their leaves now a riot of oranges, reds, and yellows. The landscape around her seemed to transform daily, the vibrant colors of fall filling the fields and hillsides with an undeniable energy. It was a time of change, a time when the world seemed to shift just slightly, as if holding its breath before the inevitable arrival of winter. Amelia had always loved the fall, the transformation of the land, the slow, steady fading of the season's vibrancy into something quieter, more introspective, felt familiar to her. The pace of the world slowed, and there was a peace in the change, a reminder that nothing stayed the same forever. The constant rhythm of the seasons reminded her that life, too, moved in cycles, and with each new cycle came new possibilities, even when they seemed hidden at first. She spent her mornings in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables, pumpkins, squash, late tomatoes, and herbs, gathering them into baskets before the first frost came. The garden had been good to her this year, its bounty more than she could have hoped for. The soil, rich and fertile, had yielded more than enough to feed her through the coming winter. It felt like a small victory, a sign that her efforts had not been in vain. The days were still full of work. The chickens and goats needed tending, the firewood needed to be stacked in preparation for the cold, and the small cottage required constant care. The evenings, once long and quiet, had grown chillier, the fire in the hearth now a necessity rather than a luxury. But even as the world around her became quieter, even as the seasons began to shift, Amelia felt a growing restlessness inside her. She couldn't quite place it, but it was there, a stirring, an unsettled feeling that seemed to rise with the changing of the leaves. It wasn't fear or anxiety, not exactly. It was a kind of quiet anticipation, as though the land itself was waiting for something. Maybe it was the shift in the weather, or the coming of winter, or maybe it was something deeper, something inside her that was yearning for a change. She couldn't pinpoint it, but she felt it, a tug in her chest, as if her life, too, was about to undergo some sort of transformation. The valley seemed to sense it too, as if the land was holding its breath, waiting for the first signs of winter to settle in. The sky had grown heavier, the clouds thick and brooding, as though the heavens were preparing for a storm. The wind, which had been gentle in the warmer months, now had a bite to it, rustling the leaves and causing the branches to sway with a restless energy. It was the kind of quiet before a storm, the kind of silence that feels charged with possibility. Amelia had learned to respect the power of the weather in this valley, how quickly it could change from calm to violent, how the winds could whip through the trees with such force that it felt like the earth itself was shifting beneath her feet. She'd seen the storms come in quickly with little warning and had learned to prepare for them. But this storm felt different. It didn't seem to have the same intensity, but it was heavy with a sense of impending change. For the first time in a long while, she thought of Ethan again, not with the grief that had once held her in its grip, but with a strange kind of curiosity. What would he think of her now, of the life she had built here? Would he recognize the person she had become? Would he see the peace she had found in this quiet, isolated corner of the world? She didn't know the answer, but the thought lingered, an echo that rippled through her thoughts as she worked. The house, the garden, the animals. It had all become so much a part of her life, but sometimes, when she stood still long enough to really feel it, she wondered if there was more. If this life, as fulfilling as it was only a part of something greater that had yet to unfold. It was in this quiet space, amidst the shift of seasons and the changing winds, that Amelia found herself wondering what the future held. She had spent so long focused on the present, on the daily routines that grounded her, that she had almost forgotten the possibility of something beyond this place, beyond the walls of her small cottage and the fields that stretched out before her. The idea of a future, one that was full of change, full of new experiences, was both exciting and daunting. Amelia had never been one for great leaps. She had always preferred the steady, the reliable, the surety of the life she had built for herself. But now, as the leaves began to fall and the world around her readied itself for winter, she found herself wondering if it was time to let go of the past, to open herself to the possibility of something new. The first signs of the storm arrived in the late afternoon. The sky darkened quickly, and the wind picked up, sending the trees bending under its force. Amelia had finished her work for the day, but as the storm approached, she found herself compelled to take one last walk through the garden, her boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The air was thick with the scent of earth and rain, the pressure in the atmosphere rising as the storm gathered strength. She stood at the edge of the garden, looking out over the land. The distant hills were barely visible through the mist that was rolling in, and the trees swayed in the wind, their branches rattling. It was a moment suspended in time, a pause before the world erupted into the chaos of the storm. And in that moment, Amelia felt a strange sense of clarity. The world was changing. She was changing. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to embrace it. She could feel the weight of the decision resting on her shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was an invitation, a promise that the future, though uncertain, held something beyond what she could see. The storm broke then, the first crack of thunder shaking the ground, followed by a torrential downpour. The wind howled, sending rain in sheets against the windows of the cottage, rattling the doorframe. Inside, Amelia stoked the fire, watching as the flames crackled and danced in the hearth, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the fierce coldness outside. She curled up in her chair by the fire, a blanket around her shoulders, and let the storm rage on. The world outside was wild and untamed, the winds howling through the trees, but inside, there was only warmth and quiet. Amelia closed her eyes, letting the sound of the storm lull her into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing that, just like the seasons, the storm too would pass. And when it did, when the world calmed once again, she would be ready to face whatever came next, ready to step into the future she had yet to imagine, but was already beginning to feel in her bones. The storm was only the beginning of something larger, something that had been growing inside her for months. Tomorrow would come, the seasons would change again, and Amelia would be there, standing on the other side, ready for whatever new chapter awaited her. Chapter 11. Embracing the Unseen. The storm raged through the night, its fury echoing against the walls of the cottage. Amelia woke several times, the sound of wind battering against the roof and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows disturbing her dreams. She lay still, listening to the tempest outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped her in a cocoon of safety. The storm had become a part of the landscape now, a force of nature that would run its course, leaving behind a new world transformed by its power. By morning, the storm had passed. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the wind, though still noticeable, no longer howled through the trees. Amelia stepped outside into the cool, damp air, the earth beneath her feet soft from the night's downpour. The world had changed again, as it always did after a storm. The sky was a muted gray, the clouds lingering, reluctant to leave. But the scent of fresh earth filled the air, and the landscape was quieter now, almost serene in its aftermath. She walked to the garden, her boots sinking into the wet earth. The leaves on the trees shimmered with moisture, their colors deeper now, saturated by the rain. The flowers in the garden bent low, heavy with droplets, and the plants she had carefully tended were now washed clean, the soil rich and dark from the rain. It was a new day, a day that carried with it the promise of renewal. Amelia moved slowly through the garden, taking in the changes that had occurred overnight. The storm had left its mark, but it had also given something back. The ground felt fertile, the air fresher. Even the plants seemed to have grown overnight, their roots soaking in the rain, their leaves stretching up toward the sky. She felt a deep sense of connection to it all, the earth, the plants, the storm. Everything had its place in the cycle, its moment of turbulence and its moment of peace. The cottage was still, the windows fogged with the warmth inside. Amelia returned to the house and set about her usual morning routine. She stoked the fire, made tea, and sat by the window, watching the rain fall softly against the earth. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to change. Amelia's thoughts drifted as she sat, her eyes tracing the pattern of the raindrops on the glass. The storm had been a reminder of nature's power, of how quickly things could change, of how nothing in life was permanent. It reminded her of the stillness she had come to cherish here, the simplicity of her life in this quiet valley. Yet, she could not ignore the stirrings inside her, the feelings that had been growing since the beginning of the summer, the sense that something was on the horizon, something new that was both exciting and terrifying. The future, once a distant and murky thing, now felt close, pressing in on her, beckoning her toward it. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the idea that there might be more for her than the life she had built here. She had always thought that this place, this cottage, was enough, that peace and solitude were all she needed. But the truth was, there were moments now when the quiet felt too still, too complete, as though she were holding her breath, waiting for something to break the silence. She had once thought that her past had left her broken, that the life she had once dreamed of was behind her, lost to time and circumstance. But now, looking out over the valley, the sky stretching endlessly above her, Amelia felt something new begin to stir. The storm had passed, but its energy lingered, its force still palpable in the air. It felt as if the storm had cleared a path, not just in the land, but in her heart as well. She could feel the stirrings of something new, something waiting to emerge. The days following the storm were marked by a quiet, steady rhythm. The rain had washed away the dust, and the land seemed to be breathing again, its life renewed by the storm. Amelia went about her work with a calm, focused energy, tending to the animals, gathering the last of the harvest, preparing for the winter. But even as she worked, the question lingered in her mind. What now? The mornings were cooler, and the evenings darker, the nights creeping in sooner with each passing day. As the sun set earlier, Amelia found herself drawn to the fire, the warmth of the hearth more inviting than ever. She spent her evenings reading by the fire, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes tracing the words on the pages, but her mind often wandered to places she hadn't dared to visit before. The world outside was changing. Winter was coming. And yet, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something else. The valley, the garden, the animals, everything had become part of her life. But her heart, too, had been touched by something deeper, something that she could not name. It was as if the storm had cleared away the last of the doubt, had swept away the remnants of the past, leaving behind an empty space, a space where something new could take root. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the stars began to prick the sky, Amelia sat by the window, watching the darkness settle over the valley. The fire crackled softly behind her, the warmth of the hearth filling the room. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She could feel the weight of the future pressing against her, but it was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. The storm had taught her something. It had shown her that change, though often violent and unexpected, was not always a bad thing. Change could bring growth. Change could bring renewal. And sometimes, change was exactly what was needed to clear away the past and make room for something new. Amelia turned from the window and walked to the table. There, beside the candlelight, were the letters she had written over the years. Letters she had never sent. The letters to Ethan, to the life she had left behind. She had never shared them with anyone, never even spoken the words aloud. But now, as her fingers traced the edges of the paper, she felt a deep sense of closure. With the storm behind her and the new season ahead, Amelia knew it was time to move forward. Time to let go of the past in a way that she hadn't allowed herself to before. Time to embrace what was coming, whatever it might be. There was no need for fear, no need for hesitation. The storm had shown her that sometimes the most profound changes come from letting go, from surrendering to the unknown. And so, as the fire burned low and the stars glittered above her, Amelia placed the letters in the fire, watching as the paper curled and turned to ash. The letters were no longer needed. The past was no longer something that had the power to hold her back. The future was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt ready. The night deepened, and the fire crackled softly, its warmth a quiet comfort against the coolness of the evening. Amelia sat back in her chair, the peace of the moment settling over her. The storm had passed. The past had passed. And now, there was only the present, only the quiet space in which she could finally, fully breathe. Chapter 12. The First Snow. The first snow of winter arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Amelia woke early, the soft light of the morning creeping in through the gaps in the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. She stood by the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she gazed out at the landscape. The world beyond was a blur of gray, the outlines of the trees and hills barely visible in the early morning light. But there was something different about this morning. The air was sharp, crisp, the scent of winter settling in. As her eyes adjusted to the scene before her, she noticed the first flakes falling. It wasn't a heavy snowfall yet, just a scattering of soft, delicate flakes drifting down like tiny feathers from the sky, but already, the ground was beginning to cover itself in a thin blanket of white. Amelia took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, sharp and refreshing. Winter had come, and with it, a new chapter. She had always welcomed the first snow, the way it transformed the world, softening the sharp edges of reality, turning the harshness of the world into something beautiful and peaceful. Snow had always held a certain magic for her, the way it muted sound, creating a quiet stillness that seemed to blanket the land, bringing a sense of calm and reflection. She dressed in layers, bundling herself up in woolen clothes and scarves to protect against the morning chill. The fire had burned low, and she stoked it back to life, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the cold air outside. As the room filled with the crackling sound of the fire, Amelia set about her usual routine. But today there was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that this day, this moment, was somehow different. She stepped outside into the quiet world, the snow now falling in earnest. It was the kind of snow that made everything seem softer, quieter. The trees were dusted with snow, their branches bending slightly under the weight of the flakes, the ground covered in a thick layer of white. It was as though the world had been remade, as though everything had been wiped clean, ready to begin anew. The air was cold, but refreshing, and as she walked through the garden, her boots sinking into the soft snow, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't quite known in a long time. The quiet of the morning was perfect, the snow muting everything around her, creating a bubble of calm. It was as though the world had been temporarily paused. the usual rhythms of life suspended in favor of something more serene, more deliberate. Amelia walked slowly, taking in the sight of the valley, the rolling hills blanketed in snow, the faint outline of the cottage just visible through the haze. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the snow in gusts, but it was a gentle wind, a reminder that winter had come not with a bang, but with a slow, steady quiet. She breathed in deeply, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. It was invigorating, like a promise of things to come. The quiet was almost overwhelming, and yet, in that silence, there was a sense of clarity. The past year had been filled with changes, some slow and steady, others unexpected. But through it all, she had found a kind of rhythm, a balance. And now, as the snow fell around her, Amelia felt the weight of the past begin to lift, carried away by the wind, replaced by a kind of quiet hope. She moved through the garden, her steps slow and deliberate, making her way to the small shed at the edge of the property. The chickens would need to be tended to, and she needed to check on the goat. There was work to be done, as always, but today it felt different. The snow had created a sense of stillness, a feeling that time was suspended, and for a brief moment, Amelia allowed herself to forget the to-do list, to forget the responsibilities that waited for her. Instead, she simply stood in the snow, letting it fall around her, watching the world shift from brown and gold to a pure, clean white. It felt like a kind of renewal, a second chance, a time to start fresh. It was the promise of new beginnings, the sense that the world was being given another opportunity to grow, to change, just as she was. She took a moment to look back at the cottage, the smoke rising gently from the chimney, the glow of the fire visible through the windows. Inside, there would be warmth and there would be life. The animals would be waiting for her. The fire would need stoking again. The kettle would need to be filled. There was always work to be done. But today, Amelia allowed herself a few more moments in the stillness. The first snow was a rare gift, one that allowed her to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to appreciate the quiet beauty of the moment. Eventually, though, the quiet stillness of the world outside couldn't keep her forever. The work of the day called to her, pulling her back to the responsibilities that always awaited. She gathered her thoughts and began her rounds, tending to the animals, checking on the garden, making sure the firewood was stacked for the coming weeks. Her movements were automatic, her hands sure and steady, but her mind wandered back to the snow, to the peacefulness that had settled over everything. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks, chopping wood, organizing the shed, and gathering more food for the coming months. But there was a sense of calm that filled the air. The snow had softened everything, making it all feel more manageable, more peaceful. The fire crackled in the hearth as the day faded into evening, and the snow continued to fall outside, covering everything in its soft, quiet blanket. By the time evening arrived, the world outside had been transformed. What had once been familiar, the trees, the fields, the path to the garden, was now obscured by a thick layer of snow, a world that looked both familiar and foreign all at once. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the air was still, as if the entire world had settled in for the night. Amelia sat by the fire, her feet warmed by the hearth, her mind quiet as she gazed out the window. The snow had a way of making everything seem possible, as though the world had been given a fresh start, and with it, so had she. There was something comforting in the way the snow transformed the world, covering up the imperfections, turning the everyday into something magical, something new. The warmth of the fire filled the cottage, the shadows of the room stretching long and deep as the night grew colder. Amelia leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the day settle in her bones. But there was no fatigue in her soul. She felt light, as though the first snow had carried away the last remnants of doubt, leaving only a sense of quiet anticipation for what was to come. The world outside may have been cold, but inside, there was warmth, and in that warmth, Amelia knew that the first snow was just the beginning. A beginning of something new, something that had been waiting to take root in her heart. The world was still turning, and though the snow might fall, though the winter might come, she felt ready to face it. And so, she watched the snow fall, as it had fallen for countless winters before, knowing that it was more than just the start of a season. It was the start of something greater, something that she was finally ready to embrace. Chapter 13. The Quiet Before the Change. The wind had settled by the time the new year arrived, the cold no longer biting, but sharp enough to remind Amelia that the world had turned again. Each season seemed to pass with greater speed, the days blending into one another, and yet, despite the steady rhythm of her life, something felt different. The days were lengthening ever so slightly, the sun hanging a little higher in the sky, casting longer shadows over the snow-covered fields. The air, though still crisp, carried with it a hint of something new, something waiting to unfurl. Amelia had spent the morning in the barn, feeding the animals and checking the supplies. Winter was always the hardest, the quietest time of year. The earth lay dormant, the trees bare of their leaves, and yet there was a subtle sense of expectancy in the air. The snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the land in a soft, unbroken layer of white. The world, outside her cottage, was peaceful, serene, almost still. But within her, something had shifted. She returned inside to the warmth of the fire. The kettle was simmering on the stove, and the cottage had the familiar scent of home. The sharp wood smoke from the hearth, the faint, earthy scent of the animals from the barn, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea. The cottage was small but warm, its sturdy stone walls protecting her from the cold outside. It had always been enough for Amelia. This life, this solitude, it had been all she needed for so long. And yet, as she sat by the fire, warming her hands, a quiet longing stirred within her. She had lived in this cottage for years, always alone, and yet the solitude, once a comfort, had started to feel heavy, as though it were pressing against her chest, weighing her down. The quiet had been both a refuge and a prison. She had spent so many years tending to the land, caring for the animals, watching the seasons change, but there was an emptiness that lingered, a gap in her life that she couldn't ignore any longer. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its quiet beauty undisturbed by the passage of time. Amelia turned her gaze to the window, watching the landscape transform as the flakes piled up, covering the earth in an even layer of soft white. The world, it seemed, was still turning, even when she felt as though she had stood still for too long. For weeks, the thought had been on her mind, the thought of leaving. Not the cottage itself, but the life she had built here. The safety of it, the quiet, the steady routine. It had all become so familiar, so comforting, and yet it had started to feel like a cage. She had once believed that solitude was all she needed, that it was enough to sustain her. But now, as the snow fell outside, Amelia couldn't ignore the yearning inside her. It was the kind of longing that couldn't be silenced, a quiet pull towards something more, something she couldn't yet name. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, but it didn't ease the tension in her chest. She sat back in her chair, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her mind. She had never been one to dream beyond her immediate surroundings. The land, the animals, the seasons. Those were the constants in her life, the things she could count on. But now, there was a restlessness that had taken root in her heart, a feeling that she couldn't ignore. She stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the world beyond. The snow had thickened, the earth now hidden beneath a blanket of white. The trees stood tall against the sky, their bare branches stark against the pale light of the afternoon. The world seemed peaceful, unchanged, as though time itself had slowed down. And yet, inside her, everything was shifting. Amelia knew that the life she had built here could no longer be enough. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt empty. She needed more. She needed to find a way to fill the space that had opened up within her. But the thought of change was daunting. It wasn't just the idea of leaving the cottage, of stepping away from the life she had known. It was the fear of what might be waiting for her beyond the comfort of solitude. The days passed, each one blending into the next, the snow never quite ceasing. Amelia spent her time in the barn and garden, tending to the animals, working with the earth, her hands busy but her mind restless. The fire was always burning, the kettle always simmering, and yet, something inside her was no longer content with just the rhythm of the seasons, the endless cycles of work and rest. She began to take longer walks, stepping away from the cottage and into the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, the snow thick beneath her boots, but it was on these walks that she felt a strange sense of clarity. The silence of the forest, the soft crunch of snow beneath her feet, helped her to clear her mind. She had always believed that silence brought peace, but now it was the stillness of the woods that gave her a sense of movement, a sense that she was not truly standing still. The days were cold, but the air was fresh, invigorating. The wind, though still sharp, was not as biting as it had been in the past weeks. Amelia would walk for hours, her breath visible in the cold, her footsteps marking the earth in small patterns that would soon be covered by the next snowfall. Each step she took seemed to carry her further from the life she had known. And yet, each step also brought her closer to something new, something she had not yet discovered. One afternoon, as she walked through the woods, she came upon a clearing she had never noticed before. It was small, hidden between two large oaks, the snow gathering in thick drifts around the base of the trees. The clearing was quiet, almost sacred in its stillness, and as Amelia stood there, the world seemed to pause for just a moment. The wind had died down, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of calm that washed over her, as though everything had fallen into place. She sat down on a fallen log, the snow crunching softly beneath her as she lowered herself onto it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the clearing fill her senses. The world was still, but inside her, a storm of emotions swirled. The yearning for change, for something more than the life she had built here, was growing stronger. She had spent so long in this place, so long waiting for something to happen, and now she realized that it was up to her to make it happen. No one else would come to change her life. She would have to take the first step. The realization was both terrifying and freeing. The fear of change, of stepping into the unknown, was heavy on her heart, but the weight of it was not as oppressive as it had once been. Amelia knew that she could no longer live in the quiet, safe routine that had once felt like home. The world was vast, and she was still young enough to experience it, to embrace whatever might come next. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Amelia stood, brushing the snow from her clothes, and took one last look at the clearing before turning back toward the path. The decision had been made. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew it was time to leave the cottage, to let go of the safety that had kept her isolated for so long. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to discover. As she walked back to the cottage, the world seemed to open up before her, the path stretching out in front of her as though the snow had cleared the way. The change was coming, and she was ready for it. Chapter 14. The journey begins. The morning after her decision arrived with a chill in the air, but the sunlight, though weak, had the warmth of a promise. Amelia had spent the night in the quiet of the cottage, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the restlessness that had begun to settle in her bones. The decision had been made. She could feel it in the steady pulse of her heart, the deep ache that still lingered. There was no going back now. The time for staying still, for waiting for life to come to her, had passed. It was time to take the next step, to move forward into the unknown. She stood by the window for a long time, watching the last of the frost melt from the glass. The world outside had changed overnight. The snow still lay thick across the land, but now it looked less like a blanket of peace and more like a path that had been laid out before her, one that she was meant to follow. The trees, still bare of their leaves, stood tall in the early light, their branches reaching toward the sky, as if urging her to take that first step. She dressed quickly, pulling on the thickest layers of wool and fleece she could find. Her hands moved automatically as she packed her small bag, nothing more than the essentials. Some food, a few changes of clothes, a spare blanket. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she didn't need to. For the first time in years, the uncertainty of it didn't scare her. It felt liberating. Outside, the air was sharp, biting at her skin as she stepped onto the snow-covered path that led away from the cottage. Her boots sank into the thick snow, the crunch of it underfoot the only sound in the stillness of the morning. The world around her was quiet, almost too quiet, and yet there was something about it that called her forward, urged her to leave the safety of her familiar surroundings behind. The barn stood just a short distance from the cottage, and she stopped there for a moment to make sure the animals were settled. The goats had been fed, the chickens taken care of, and the fire in the barn was still burning low, providing enough warmth for the livestock. She ran her hands along the rough wood of the barn door, feeling its solidity beneath her fingers. This place had been home for so long, and now it felt like a memory. She would leave it behind, like so many things that had once held her, tethered her to a life she no longer wanted. With one last glance at the barn, Amelia turned and continued down the path, the wind picking up around her, stirring the snow. The landscape stretched out before her, empty but vast, the snowfields dotted with sparse clusters of trees. She had walked these paths countless times, but today they felt different. Today, they felt like a beginning, not a routine. Her feet moved steadily, the rhythm of her walk becoming a kind of meditation, a way to silence the churning thoughts in her mind. The uncertainty, once overwhelming, had faded. She was stepping into the unknown with open eyes, ready to embrace whatever came her way. She had no destination in mind, no specific plan. All she knew was that the path ahead would lead her to something new, something beyond the walls of the cottage. As she walked, the land slowly began to change. The snow remained, but now there were patches of frozen ground peeking through, the bare earth showing beneath the ice. The trees, still skeletal in their appearance, began to thin, giving way to open fields. The air smelled different here, fresher, less enclosed. The wind carried a promise, one that Amelia could feel deep in her bones. She had no idea what that promise was, but she was certain she would find it if she kept moving. The hours passed quickly. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light warming the earth just enough to make the air feel less harsh. Amelia didn't stop to rest. There was no need. She felt a new energy inside her, a quiet determination that propelled her forward. She could feel her muscles working with every step, the warmth of the movement spreading through her body, pushing away the cold of the early morning. By midday, she had reached a small village. It was quiet, the kind of place where life seemed to unfold at its own pace, without the rush and clamor of larger towns. There was a small market square at the center, a few houses scattered around the outskirts. Amelia paused at the edge of the village, watching it for a moment before walking through its narrow streets. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a place to rest for a while, perhaps get a meal, and decide what to do next. The village was peaceful, its people going about their daily routines with an easy, unhurried grace. There were children playing in the snow, their laughter ringing through the air, and old women sitting on porches, wrapped in blankets, enjoying the warmth of the sun. Amelia passed them by, her presence unnoticed, her movements purposeful. She didn't stop to speak to anyone, nor did anyone speak to her. She was just another face in a world that was moving forward without her. She found a small inn, its wooden sign swaying in the breeze. The innkeeper was an older woman with a friendly smile, and she welcomed Amelia inside with a nod. The warmth of the building wrapped around her like a blanket, and for the first time since she had left the cottage, she allowed herself to relax. She ordered a meal, her first real food of the day, and sat at a small table by the window. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room, and outside, the snow continued to fall softly. As she ate, Amelia felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She was no longer on a journey away from something. She was on a journey toward something. The weight of her past, of the years spent in the solitude of the cottage, was beginning to lift. She had made the choice to leave, and now she could feel the freedom that came with it. The world was wide, and she was finally ready to embrace it. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. Amelia spent some time exploring the village, watching the ebb and flow of life around her. It was a small, quiet place, and yet it was full of life. People working, laughing, going about their daily tasks. It reminded her of the world she had left behind, but it was a different world now, a world that seemed to promise something more, something she had been searching for without even realizing it. As evening approached, the air grew colder, and the light of the day began to fade. Amelia returned to the inn, her body tired but her mind awake with possibilities. She had made it this far, and now she felt the pull of something greater. She didn't know where she would go next, but she knew she would continue on. The journey had just begun, and though it was still uncertain, it was hers to take. The fire in the hearth crackled warmly as the innkeeper brought her a fresh pot of tea. Amelia accepted it with a nod of thanks, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. She felt at peace for the first time in a long while. She was alone, yes, but she was no longer isolated. The world was wide, and she was moving through it, step by step. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its soft beauty filling the world with a quiet kind of magic. Amelia took a deep breath, letting the moment settle around her, and in that stillness, she realized that she had begun the journey of a lifetime. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and that thought filled her with a quiet joy. She had taken the first step, and now there was nothing to do but keep moving forward. Chapter 15. The Road of Discovery. The first few days after leaving the village were slow, the quiet of the open road enveloping Amelia like a familiar cloak. The land stretched endlessly before her, undisturbed except for the occasional patch of trees or the distant silhouette of a farmhouse. The roads were narrow and winding, lined with tall grasses that swayed gently in the wind, their tips just brushing against her legs as she walked. The sun was high in the sky, warming the earth beneath her boots, and yet, despite the comfortable weather, a lingering chill remained in the air, a reminder that the seasons had not yet fully turned. She had no specific direction, no goal in mind, except to move forward. There was freedom in that, an unburdened sense of possibility. Every morning, she awoke with the quiet certainty that there was more to see, more to experience beyond the horizon. And each evening, as the sun dipped low, she found a place to rest, whether under the cover of trees or by the side of a road, grateful for the stillness of the world around her. Her days passed in a simple rhythm, walking, resting, walking again. The landscape began to change, growing more varied as she moved farther from the familiar village. The flat plains gave way to gentle hills, and soon, the hills were replaced by dense forests. The trees here were different, taller, their trunks thick and twisted, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun in some places, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual shadow. The air felt cooler in these woods, the scent of pine and damp earth mixing with the faint smell of snow still lingering in the air. One afternoon, Amelia came upon a stream, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. She knelt beside it, her reflection rippling as the current flowed gently by. She paused, watching the water for a long time, mesmerized by the way it moved, its clarity so pure it seemed to carry the answers to every question she had ever asked. There was something peaceful in the way the water moved, unstoppable, yet calm, flowing through the land, carving its path as it went. She felt a kinship with it, as though the stream understood the journey she was on. She sat there for a long time, simply watching the water, letting the sounds of the forest fill the space around her. There were no distractions, no rushing thoughts. The world felt suspended in that moment, and Amelia allowed herself to be part of it, just another passing element in the grand, unhurried rhythm of nature. As the sun sank lower, the light grew softer, painting the trees in golden hues. Amelia rose to her feet, stretching her legs, feeling the stiffness from days of walking. She filled her water bottle from the stream, took a deep breath, and continued on her way. The road ahead was still unclear, but the uncertainty no longer felt daunting. The movement of the days, the changing landscape, had brought her to a place where the unknown was no longer a source of fear. It had become a source of curiosity, of anticipation. The next few days followed the same pattern, though with subtle changes in the scenery. She passed through small, quiet villages, each with its own rhythm, its own life. Some were nestled between high hills, their rooftops peeking out from the trees. Others lay beside rivers, the sound of the flowing water joining the chatter of the people who lived there. Amelia passed through them all, never staying for long, always moving, always following the pull of something beyond what was familiar. In one village, she paused longer than usual. The people were kind, offering her food and shelter for the night. She accepted without hesitation, grateful for the brief respite. The evening was peaceful, the warmth of the fire and the soft murmur of the townsfolk soothing her tired body. She had spent so much time alone in recent years, in the quiet of the forest and the solitude of the road, that the presence of others was almost strange to her. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar. There was an ease in the quiet that she had come to enjoy, and yet, for the first time in a long while, she found herself considering the simple joy of connection. As night fell, she sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, casting shadows on the walls of the small cottage. She had never been one to seek company, but as she watched the people around her, she realized that there was something beautiful about the shared experience of life. The way the firelight flickered in their eyes, the way they smiled at each other. It was a reminder that no one walked alone in this world. Everyone was part of a larger story, their lives weaving together in a dance of moments, small and fleeting, but meaningful all the same. The next morning, she left the village as quietly as she had arrived, not wanting to disrupt the peacefulness of the place. The road ahead stretched on, but the sense of discovery had grown in her heart. She wasn't searching for something specific anymore. She had stopped looking for answers and started embracing the journey itself. The world was unfolding in its own time, and she was simply walking alongside it, part of its story, just as the people in the village were part of hers. As she walked on, the land began to change once more. The forests grew thicker, the air heavier with the scent of earth and moss. She came across wildflower fields, their colors bursting in contrast to the green and brown of the earth. The wind carried their fragrance to her, and she stopped to breathe it in, closing her eyes for a moment, savoring the sensation of the world coming alive around her. The seasons were shifting once again. and the promise of spring was in the air. One evening, as she set up camp beside a small river, she noticed something that caught her eye: a distant mountain range, its peaks shrouded in mist. They looked impossibly far away, but for the first time in weeks, Amelia felt a pull toward them. It was a quiet invitation, a call from the landscape itself, urging her to keep moving forward. She could feel the weight of her journey, the miles she had already walked, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The mountains were there, waiting for her, and she knew that one day, she would reach them. The days blurred into one another, the rhythm of her footsteps becoming a part of the larger rhythm of the world. She moved with the land, following the curves of the roads, the dips and rises of the hills, until she no longer knew where one day ended and the next began. Her body was strong, her steps sure, and with every mile, she felt herself becoming more attuned to the world around her, more attuned to herself. It wasn't just the landscapes that had changed. It was her too. The girl who had left the cottage, unsure of herself, unsure of where she was going, had transformed into someone else. She had shed the skin of uncertainty, of the quiet life she had once clung to, and had become part of something larger, something unknown. The road had revealed her to herself, had shown her that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. As the days passed, the mountains grew closer, the peaks now visible in the distance, towering above the land. The road that had once felt like an endless stretch of unknown had become a journey with a clear destination. It wasn't just the mountains she was heading toward. It was the promise they represented, the promise of change, of growth, of a life that was still waiting to be fully realized. Amelia knew that she was close now. The landscape, the seasons, the people she had met, they had all led her here, to this moment. And though she had no idea what the mountains would bring, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The road had not been easy, nor had it been quick, but it had been hers. And that, Amelia realized, was all that mattered. The journey was far from over, but as she stood at the edge of the river, watching the sun dip behind the distant mountains, she knew that she had already found what she had been searching for. Not in the world around her, but in herself. The road had led her here, and in that moment, it felt like home. Chapter 16. The Summit. The morning dawned clear and bright, with the first rays of sunlight piercing the sky over the distant peaks. Amelia woke to the soft sounds of the forest around her, the rustling of leaves in the cool morning breeze, the chirping of birds in the trees. Her body felt stronger now, more accustomed to the long days of walking, and she could feel the steady pulse of her heart as it beat in rhythm with the land. Each step was becoming easier, more natural, and though the distance ahead was still great, there was a deep certainty inside her that the summit was within reach. The road that had once seemed endless now had a clear direction. The mountains had been growing closer for days, their jagged peaks rising ever higher, their snow-capped tops glimmering in the distance. The air had grown thinner, sharper, and the landscape around her had shifted once again, becoming more rugged, more wild. The trees that had lined her path before had thinned, giving way to rocky outcroppings and steep slopes. The land felt ancient here, as though the earth itself had been shaped by forces far beyond human understanding. As she began her ascent, the terrain grew more difficult. The path she had followed for so long now dwindled into a series of narrow, winding trails that hugged the sides of cliffs and rocky ravines. The air was colder here, and the wind carried a bite to it that stung her face and fingers. Yet, despite the physical strain, there was a sense of exhilaration in her chest, an excitement that rose with every step. She could feel the pull of the mountains deep within her, like a gravitational force drawing her upward, urging her to keep going, to climb higher, to reach that place where the land and sky met. The landscape changed as she moved higher, the trees now sparse, replaced by scrubby bushes and patches of wildflowers. The ground beneath her feet was rocky, uneven, but she navigated it with ease, her muscles strong from the weeks of walking, her body accustomed to the strain. Every now and then, she would stop and look out over the valley below. The view was breathtaking. An endless expanse of rolling hills and forests, rivers winding like veins through the land, all stretching out beneath her, far beyond where the eye could see. As she climbed, the air grew thinner, and the temperature dropped. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow passes and sending gusts of cold air sweeping across the rocky terrain. Amelia's breath came faster now, her steps slower as the altitude pressed against her. The summit, though still some distance away, seemed close enough now to touch. But the climb was not without its challenges. The last stretch was the most difficult. The path became steeper, the rocks more treacherous. There were moments when she had to scramble up ledges, her hands and feet gripping the cold, rough stone, her body pushed to its limits. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She moved with purpose, each step a small victory, a testament to her strength, her resolve. She had come so far. The world she had left behind felt distant now, a memory that faded with every upward step. The village, the forest, the quiet road. Those were pieces of her past. The future was here, in these mountains, in this journey, in the climb that had become so much more than just reaching the top. It had become a path of self-discovery, a journey towards something deeper than she had ever imagined. Finally, after hours of climbing, she reached the top. She paused for a moment, standing at the summit, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her legs trembling from the effort. The air was thin up here, but it felt sharp and pure, filling her lungs with a clarity she hadn't known in years. The view was beyond anything she had ever imagined. The mountains stretched out in every direction, their jagged peaks piercing the sky, their valleys deep and shadowed. Below her, the world seemed small, a patchwork of green and brown, rivers like veins cutting through the earth. And yet, despite the grandeur of the scene, the most remarkable thing about the summit was the stillness. The wind had died down, the world around her silent, as though holding its breath. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for her to take in the moment. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the sense of accomplishment wash over her, letting the stillness of the mountains fill her heart. The journey had led her here, to this place of peace, of understanding. She had walked through countless days of uncertainty, through the vastness of the landscape, through the changing seasons, each step taking her closer to something she hadn't fully understood until now. The mountains were more than just a physical destination. They were a metaphor for everything she had been through. The climb, the struggle, the effort. It had all been a part of the process, a necessary part of finding herself. As she stood there, alone at the top of the world, she realized that the journey had already given her what she had been searching for. It wasn't a place, or a person, or a particular moment. It was the journey itself. It was the strength she had discovered in herself, the courage to keep moving forward, even when the road seemed impossible. The mountains had taught her that the path to self-discovery was never easy, but it was always worth it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the land, turning the sky into a canvas of pinks and oranges. The air grew cooler as the light faded, and Amelia knew that it was time to start her descent. But as she turned away from the summit, her heart was full, not of longing or desire, but of peace. She had come to the top, and in doing so, she had come to a deeper understanding of herself. She had reached the summit not only of the mountains, but of her own journey, her own life. She began her descent slowly, carefully, her movements deliberate, as though she didn't want to disturb the stillness of the place she had just left behind. Each step down felt lighter, less burdened than the climb had been. The road ahead was still unknown, but now it seemed more like an opportunity than a challenge. She had reached the top, and now she was ready for whatever came next. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the world in twilight, Amelia continued on her way. The journey wasn't over. It never truly was. But for the first time in a long time, she was content with the knowledge that she had already found what she was looking for. The summit had been more than just a physical place. It had been a moment of realization, a moment of clarity. And now, she was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, knowing that she was stronger than she had ever been, more at peace than she had ever imagined. The road stretched out before her, wide and open, and she stepped forward with a quiet confidence, ready for whatever came next. The journey would continue, but she no longer walked in search of something. She walked as someone who had already found what she needed, someone who was no longer bound by uncertainty, but free to embrace the world, step by step.